take back these causes back to us. Because when I look at people like Roger Payne, for example, who was one of the pioneers of the Save the Whales movement, Roger Payne was, is, should I say, and I would love to have him on my podcast. He's one of my heroes, believe me. Roger Payne is a logical, thinking person. He's reasonable, he's not hyper-emotional, and he keeps his cool under fire. Now, we don't see that in the environment movement today because of the fact that it's been hijacked. And so I'm not saying the right should reclaim the environment. I'm saying reasonable people, whether they're right, centrist, or even centre-left. In other words, people to the right, people who are to the right of Bernie that SJWs like to call Nazis, quote unquote. I want to see us reasonable people take back the environment movement and say, no, it's actually looking after the environment is not some clownish, mutated idea. It's actually a very pragmatic idea because we don't have a home if we don't look after our environment. So that's kind of where I'm at. That is basically where I am today. And that is where I'm coming this podcast from. 2 more things before I talk about the dolphin captivity cause and give a bit of background. First of all, I am not vegan. And I will actually I want to at some stage, this is only the first podcast, so these things aren't going to happen overnight. But over the course of this podcast, I actually want to talk about ethical and responsible meat eating. Because the nutritional research I've done, whether vegans like it or not, suggests that we humans are naturally an omnivorous species, which means we need both animal and plant foods in our diets to be healthy. And on a pragmatic level, while I care very deeply about animal welfare, I don't see the point. I don't see how starving myself of essential nutrients is going to help animals in the long run. So I do eat meat. I actually encourage eating meat. I do not encourage veganism because the research I've done, and I will get people on to talk about this on my podcast and on later podcasts, suggests that veganism is actually in the long term very detrimental to your health. So you're not going to be in any position to help animals if you are a long-term vegan and suffering from the health effects that go with that. So I'm not vegan and I'm not going to be promoting veganism on my podcast. That's the first thing. The second thing is that I am not a climate change skeptic, but I am a climate change centrist. This podcast is going to be free of climate change alarmism. So if anybody contacts me and wants to be interviewed on my podcast, I'm okay with that. But please take your climate change alarmism somewhere else. It is not welcome here, and I will not be hosting any sort of climate change alarmism discussions on this podcast. No climate change alarmism and no veganism here. I'm sorry. And of course, like I said earlier, if these climate change alarmists and vegans want to talk about their things, that's fine by me. They are quite within their rights to do so. I would never want to see them deplatformed. But this podcast is not their platform, and I'm going to make that clear. So, that is another disclaimer before I move on to the cause. Basically, this podcast, I will be discussing some very thorny, tricky topics to navigate. I will be talking about some pretty controversial things throughout the course of this podcast. Things that both directly and indirectly affect whale and dolphin conservation. And I recognise that that both myself and the guests I may have on this podcast are probably going to say things that will offend people. Now, we live in a culture where where there's a lot of professionally offended people. I understand that. So I just want to put out this disclaimer. If you are offended by anything that either myself or any of my guests say on this podcast, that is okay. I'm totally okay with that. However, please take responsibility for your offence. Please do not come crying to me that something someone said has hurt your feelings, because quite frankly, I'm not going to listen. Your feelings are your responsibility, and I am expecting that on this podcast I will be speaking to and broadcasting to responsible adults who are responsible for their feelings, and therefore, if something offends them, then they will take responsibility for that offence themselves. Please don't come crying to me. You will not get any sympathy, and I will not retract or edit anything out because it offends somebody. Please understand that right off the bat. This podcast, obviously with the guidelines I've put in place, is a free speech zone. If it offends somebody, that's your problem, not mine. Okay, so that's enough about me. What about the cause? So what exactly is dolphin captivity? Well, dolphin captivity basically it started in the 1960s with the 1960s TV series called Flipper. And most people are aware of who or what Flipper is unless they've been living in a cardboard box their whole lives. Flipper, of course, was a bottlenose dolphin who had a TV series made about. I haven't actually seen the TV series, and frankly, I don't really want to. But Flipper was played by, I think it was 3 different, or was it 5 different female dolphins, bottlenose dolphins. Their trainer was a man called Richard O'Barry, or Rick O'Barry, who realised just how unhappy dolphins were in captivity, and he left the dolphin captivity scene essentially and started his own NGO called Rick O'Barry's Dolphin Project on Earth Day in 1970. Anyway, so basically what dolphin captivity entails is that dolphins that are evolved to live in the sea, they have echolocation sensors, which basically means they use sound and sonar to navigate their way around. It's a very, very effective navigation system when you live out in the deep blue sea. And they like I've said before, their brains are more neurologically complex than ours. So they have highly complex social structures called pods. They're very family orientated. Of course, the pod structure depends on the species of dolphin. Different species have different pod structures, but they essentially have very complex social structures, very complex languages. They have different dialects and, yes, even different races in some species, which I will talk about in later podcasts. But essentially, what it means is that these dolphins are ripped away from their pods and they are put into small tanks that are often about the size of a swimming pool, perhaps a little bit bigger. And they live in these tanks. They have no stimulation. They are basically sensory deprived. They are trained to do these tricks that you see them do at dolphin shows through food deprivation. So they are essentially kept hungry so that they will do the trick in order that they get fed. That's food deprivation. The fact that their tanks are just concrete tanks with concrete walls, which their sonar location bounces off whenever they use it, which is kind of what it would be like for us to live in a room full of mirrors where where the floor, the ceiling and the walls are all mirrored and there's just no escaping the sensory perceptions that would bring. So they're food deprived, they're sensory deprived, they're also deprived of any mental stimulation. Remember, these are animals with brains that are more neurologically complex than our own. So what it boils down to is the way these dolphins are treated in captive facilities is, if this was done to human beings, the perpetrators, when caught, would be hauled up in front of the International Criminal Court in The Hague, having to answer for charges related to the Geneva Conventions on torture. So, yet we think this is okay to do this to a being that is clearly sentient and that is clearly has a brain that is more neurologically complex than our own. Well, actually, no, it's not, and I've talked about, for the rest of this podcast, why that's not okay. So, that is pretty much the rundown on the dolphin captivity industry. So there are a whole myriad of so-called entertainment options that dolphins are sold into. The most common one is the traditional dolphin show, which is where you sit on those bench seats around the amphitheatre-like structure that surrounds the tanks where the dolphins live, and you sit there and watch dolphins jump through hoops and do stupid tricks with their trainers to really loud pop music, and you sit there and clap and think and get told by the trainers how much they love dolphins and how everybody's a happy family. That's the traditional dolphin show. And as you can imagine, as I'll prove in this podcast, the whole setup came out the south end of a whale. So that basically is the traditional dolphin show. And as I'll show you in a minute, it is bogus. The other forms of entertainment, so-called, that are sort of more recent are the swim with dolphin programs, where they are particularly common in resorts, in ports where cruise ships call into, where the dolphins live in tanks and you go into the swim with program and you are supposedly interacting with this dolphin, where they're supposed to be towing you around and kissing you for a selfie. They do all this so that they actually get fed. Again, it's torturous food deprivation. It would be against the law to do it to humans. This is the dolphin captivity, essentially, swim with programs. And, of course, now the latest one is dolphin-assisted therapy, which is one I actually want to cover in future podcasts, because while there are benefits to the sound, to being exposed to the sounds that cetaceans make, I actually have first-hand experience with this, which I'll go into in a later podcast. I recognise that there are definite benefits to those sounds. However, there is something, as particularly from the point of view of a pagan like me, there is something inherently wrong about capturing an animal and causing it misery and expecting it to, quote, heal, end of quote, disabled children. Healers are beings that give of their healing gifts freely and openly. They should, if as soon as a healer is coerced by any means into giving of himself to heal, he's no longer a healer. So, yeah, I will do definitely, but dolphin-assisted therapy I'm not okay with. Absolutely not. But I will do. It's a very comprehensive issue. There's a lot of dynamics within the issue, and I think it warrants itself its own podcast, but for now I will say I'm not okay with it. They're kind of the main forms of dolphin captivity that you see today. Of course, also the United States and Israel, to my knowledge, have Navy dolphins. There are countries I know, to my knowledge, have them. Other countries probably do as well, and I need to research that because it'll be good to do a podcast on it. So, that is essentially what the dolphin captivity scene entails. And of course, people pay to be supposedly entertained by these dolphins, who are essentially tortured into entertainment and their spirits are broken. But what's just as concerning is how they're actually caught. I would have to look up the statistic, but it's, shall we say, the vast majority of dolphins that are caught from the wild are caught in a fishing village called Taiji, which is in southern Japan. And every year from September to March, dolphins are driven into a small cove and they are either slaughtered or captured, but the captives are the ones that make the money. And the captives often see pod members slaughtered in front of them, which are often their own family. Remember, dolphins have very strong social bonds. They see other pod members being tortured and captured in front of them. And if any of the dolphins are lucky to be released out to sea, then they go out to sea very severely traumatized. So basically this process is extremely traumatic. It is it's brutal. The slaughters themselves are brutal. They're slaughtered for meat which is mercury laden. Dolphin meat contains mercury that far exceeds what the WHO considers to be toxic levels for human consumption. So it's a meat that should not be consumed. Even though I'm a meat eater, I certainly would not recommend consuming mercury-laden dolphin meat. And it's also like I said, the slaughters are very cruel, and often calves are orphaned and dumped back out to sea as well, with pretty much no hope of survival. So this hunt in Taiji goes on from September to March every year, which is the Japanese winter, pretty much. And basically this Taiji is ground zero for the dolphin captivity industry. Of course, there are other places in the globe where dolphins are captured, but Taiji is the one place where the capture of live dolphins and the sale of live dolphins is industrialised. So, and of course, these dolphins are sold to aquariums around the globe. And not to mention that I think it's something like, is it 60%? I can't remember the exact statistic of dolphins in